Margaret gently rocked her 7-month-old son Noah as she gazed out the window at the Boston skyline. The weight and warmth of this tiny life in her arms brought her a happiness beyond compare. "Noah, Mama will always protect you," she whispered. Working as a nurse in the pediatric department at Boston General Hospital, Margaret understood the weight of responsibility that came with having a child better than most. Her husband, Brian, was successful as an environmental consultant, and the peaceful home they had built together was Margaret's greatest treasure. She heard the sound of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Brian was preparing breakfast. He was a kind and thoughtful husband who had been actively involved in childcare since Noah was born. If there was one worry, though, it was his relationship with his family. "Margaret, my mother called. She wants to stop by this afternoon," Brian said. Margaret sighed softly at his words. His mother, Helen, was pleasant enough on the surface, claiming to enjoy making things by hand and constantly bringing gifts. However, her creations were always shoddy, sometimes completely unusable. Just last month, she had knitted a sweater for Noah that had sleeves of different lengths and a neck opening too tight to pull over his head. "Diana's coming too," Brian added. "Can you imagine making $10,000 a month just from YouTube, all from home? That's exactly what she did with her stories. No face, no voice. Check the link in the description if you're curious." Margaret's expression darkened further at the mention of Brian's sister. Diana affirmed everything her mother did and didn't even try to hide her snide remarks toward Margaret. "It'll be fine. Mom just wants some attention," Brian said. But Margaret knew it wasn't that simple. She sensed something intentional behind the smiles Helen and Diana showed, and the way they treated Brian when she wasn't around was so different from how they behaved when she was present. At 3 in the afternoon, the intercom rang as expected. "Welcome, Helen." "Diana," Margaret greeted them with as natural a smile as she could manage. Helen was dressed in expensive designer clothes. Diana, who had inherited her mother's good looks, wore perfect makeup and sophisticated clothing as usual. "Margaret, how have you been? Where's Noah?" Helen asked as soon as she entered. "He just woke up from his nap. He's in the living room." When they entered the living room, Helen's face lit up at the sight of Noah in Brian's arms. "Oh, my precious grandson!" Grandma Helen took Noah into her arms, acting as if he were her own child. Then she pulled a package from her large bag and handed it to Margaret with a proud expression. "It's a special baby blanket. I worked really hard on it. It's my hobby. I'm sure you'll like it." Margaret thanked her and opened the package. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary pastel blue blanket, but the texture was strange, with areas that felt oddly stiff, almost like soap residue. "It's a bit tacky, but it suits you perfectly," Diana said with a meaningful smile. In that moment, Margaret felt an indescribable unease at the glance exchanged between the sisters. However, to keep peace in the family, she expressed her gratitude. "Thank you, Helen. I'll cherish it." "Please do. It's a very special blanket," Helen replied. There was something hidden in her words. Margaret picked up the blanket again and examined it closely. The stitching was sloppy, and there was a faint, distinctive odor. Brian tried to honor his mother's feelings by placing the blanket near Noah, but Margaret had already decided in her heart that she would never use this blanket for her child. Later, Margaret carefully folded Helen's blanket and tucked it into the back of her bedroom closet, hiding it under clothes she rarely wore. She had already prepared several soft, safe, organic cotton blankets for Noah. As a professional nurse, she was extremely careful about what she used for her baby. "I'll just bring it out when Helen visits," she told herself. Over the next few weeks, Helen began visiting surprisingly often. She developed a habit of asking the same question every time. "Are you using that blanket? Does Noah like it?" Margaret always gave vague answers and occasionally brought the blanket out to show her. But as soon as Helen left, it went right back into the depths of the closet. She simply couldn't bring herself to use it for her baby. "Brian, I can't understand why your mother is so fixated on that blanket," Margaret confided to her husband one day. Mom just wants to feel like her creations are being used. You're overthinking it, Brian replied. But Margaret wasn't convinced. A month later, on a Friday night, Margaret was working the night shift at the hospital. Brian was left to take care of Noah alone. Though not as meticulous as his wife, he took his responsibilities as a father seriously. In the middle of the night, Noah began to cry. Brian changed his diaper and gave him milk, but he wouldn't stop crying. Brian gently picked up his son and walked around the living room, trying to soothe him. Suddenly, Noah moved vigorously and spit up on the blanket Brian had wrapped him in. "Oops, it's okay, Noah," Brian murmured, calming the baby as he removed the soiled blanket. Thinking he needed a clean one, he searched the closet. He couldn't find any blankets on the shelf where Margaret usually kept them. As he continued searching, he found Helen's blanket hidden under some clothes. "This will do," he thought, and wrapped Noah in it. Fortunately, Noah quickly calmed down and fell asleep. The next morning, when Margaret returned from her night shift, Brian was preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Noah was sleeping peacefully in his crib. "Good morning," Margaret said, kissing Brian on the cheek. "How was last night?" "It was fine. He spit up a little, but no problem," Brian answered with a smile. "Oh, I need to wash the blanket Noah was using." Margaret went to check on Noah and smiled at the sight of her sleeping son. Then she casually glanced at the crib and froze. Helen's blanket was wrapped around him. She gasped. "Brian, why did you use this blanket?" Brian turned around, surprised by the sharpness in her tone. "Noah spit up, so I replaced it with this one I found in the closet. Is there a problem?" Margaret took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "This is Helen's blanket. I've been keeping it away from Noah." "Why? You need to consider Mom's feelings," Brian said gently. "I can feel it. There's something wrong with this blanket." Brian scratched his head. "You're overreacting. It looks normal enough. Anyway, I'll wash it." Margaret tried to stop him, but Brian had already taken the blanket to the laundry room. She was exhausted, so she decided to lie down for a while. Noah was sleeping safely, and washing the blanket shouldn't be a problem, she told herself. Several hours later, Margaret was jolted awake by a shout. "Margaret, look at this!" Brian's voice carried obvious distress. Margaret rushed to the living room, where Brian stood trembling, holding the blanket spread out in his hands. Margaret froze. The blanket, discolored by water and heat, now clearly revealed a hospital logo and symbols. The words, "Biohazard Processed," were stamped in red, along with medical waste identification codes. This is medical waste," Margaret whispered. With her nursing knowledge, she instantly understood what she was seeing. Her stomach dropped. Brian stared at her in disbelief. "What do you mean? Did Mom deliberately—" Margaret was already grabbing her phone, calling her friend, a pediatrician. "Although Noah was only in contact with it briefly, we need tests, just in case. I need to take Noah to the hospital right away," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "Brian, call Helen. Ask her to explain what this is." Brian shook his head, still staring at the blanket. "I can't believe it. Mom wouldn't do something like this." Margaret picked up Noah, forcing herself to stay calm, though inside her, flames of anger were rising. The pediatric outpatient department at Boston General Hospital was busy, even on a Saturday afternoon. Margaret felt embarrassed facing her colleagues, but her son's health came first. Her friend, Dr. Carroll, immediately escorted Noah into an examination room after hearing the situation. "It's going to be all right, Margaret. We'll run tests right away," Carroll said, maintaining both professional composure and the warmth of a friend. Margaret had handled countless emergencies as a nurse, but when it was her own child, maintaining professionalism was nearly impossible. She hid her trembling hands as she watched Noah laughing on the examination table. "It's good the contact time was short," Carol said as she reviewed the initial findings. "There are no symptoms at this point. We've done blood tests as a precaution, but the results won't be back until tomorrow. We need to know more about the materials and processing of that blanket." Margaret let out a shaky breath. "Thank you, Carol. I'm so sorry about this on a Saturday." What are you saying? This is serious, Carol replied, frowning. Where did that blanket come from? It was a gift from my mother-in-law. You're kidding, Carol said, her eyes widening. She deliberately gave you something like this? At that moment, Margaret's phone rang. It was Brian. Margaret, he said, his voice shaking with anger and confusion. I called Mom. I can't believe it. She says it was just a joke. She told me not to be so angry. Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Noah seems okay for now. We're waiting on blood test results. Brian, this isn't just cruelty. This could be a legal issue. I know, Brian said, determination hardening his voice. I'm heading to Mom's house now. I'll talk to her directly. After hanging up, Margaret explained everything to Carol, who immediately became serious. Margaret, we need to submit that blanket to the hospital's safety management department. Misappropriation of medical waste is extremely serious. Margaret nodded. I want to investigate this too. Helen used to work as a nursing assistant at another hospital. With Carol's help, Margaret sealed the blanket in a sample bag and submitted it to the hospital's safety management department. Then she accessed the hospital database and began researching the medical waste identification codes. Her colleague Jessica came over to assist. This code is from Maine General Medical Center, Jessica said. It's a disposal label from about 2 years ago. You might get more detailed information if you contact that hospital. Margaret felt a chill run through her. She remembered that her mother-in-law had once worked at Maine General Medical Center. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. Meanwhile, Brian had parked in front of Helen's house. Diana's car was there too. He knocked on the door, struggling to control his anger. Brian, what's going on? Why such a fuss? Helen asked, opening the door with an expression of feigned innocence. Stop pretending, Mom, Brian said, his voice shaking. That blanket, when we washed it, medical waste markings appeared. Why would you give something like that to a baby? Well, come in. The neighbors will hear you, Helen said, ushering him inside. In the living room, Diana sat on the sofa, polishing her nails. She glanced up and smiled faintly. You're overreacting. It's just a blanket. Just a blanket? Brian stared at her. It might contain hazardous substances. Noah is at the hospital being tested right now. If it's so dangerous, the hospital should manage it better, Helen replied coldly. Besides, your wife always acts like the expert. I just wanted to give her a little trouble. That's right, Diana added. It was annoying how Margaret always says, as a nurse. We were betting whether she'd notice. Brian stood there, speechless. So you put a baby's health at risk? Brian finally said, his voice hoarse. Your own grandson? You're overreacting, Helen said, waving a dismissive hand. It was just a prank. It's not dangerous. Hospitals clean used items before disposal. Then why would you do something like this? Brian asked, pressing his hands to his temples. I worked as a nursing assistant for 20 years, Helen said proudly. I didn't like that Margaret didn't respect my experience. She's always talking about the latest childcare methods and ignoring my advice. And she doesn't even use my handmade items, does she? I know she hid them in the closet. Hearing those words, memories from Brian's childhood surfaced. His mother had always enjoyed pranks, regularly playing small tricks on people she didn't like. He had always looked the other way. Mom, this isn't just a prank, he said firmly. Margaret has an obligation to report this to the hospital. This could become a legal issue. The color drained from Helen's face. What? Unauthorized removal of medical waste is a crime, Brian continued, especially if it potentially contains hazardous materials. Wait a minute, Diana cut in. Are you going to report your own mother? You're being manipulated by Margaret. Brian turned to his sister. This is about Noah's safety. You don't understand the gravity of what you've done. Margaret is investigating where that blanket came from. Maine General Medical Center, right? Helen collapsed into a chair, her knees giving out. I just wanted to... What? Brian demanded. What did you want to do? Helen suddenly began to cry. I wanted to get back at Margaret. She thinks she's a better mother than me. She rejected my parenting methods.
So you put a baby at risk?
Brian shouted. The phone rang. Brian answered. It was Margaret. Brian, I've got confirmation, she said. Her voice was calm, but he could hear the strain beneath it. That blanket is definitely medical waste from Maine General Medical Center. It may have belonged to an infectious disease patient. We're waiting for the blood test results, but the Safety Management Department is taking this very seriously. Brian looked at his mother. Helen covered her face with both hands, her shoulders shaking. I understand, Brian said quietly into the phone. I'm coming home now. We'll figure out how to handle this together. After hanging up, Brian stood in silence for a long moment. Then he spoke. Mom, I'm going to protect Margaret and my son. You're going to have to take responsibility for your actions. He left the house without another word. In the car, he gripped the steering wheel tightly, guilt weighing heavily on his chest. He blamed himself for turning a blind eye to his mother's behavior all these years. Margaret's intuition had been right all along. The following afternoon, the living room of Margaret and Brian's home was filled with an unusual tension. Official hospital test documents lay spread across the table as they sat side by side on the sofa. Noah was being cared for by a friend in another room. Fortunately, the blood tests came back negative. Noah is safe, Margaret said quietly. But low concentrations of formaldehyde and traces of blood components were detected in the blanket. Regular follow-up will be necessary. Brian let out a deep sigh. What was Mom thinking? She wasn't thinking, Margaret said bitterly. She doesn't understand the seriousness of what she did. The doorbell rang. Brian stood and opened the door to greet attorney Jennifer Cohen. I'm sorry to meet you both under such difficult circumstances, Attorney Cohen said gravely. Let me review the situation once more. As Margaret explained everything, the attorney took careful notes. When the story was finished, she reviewed the documents and looked up. There are two separate issues here, she explained. One is a civil matter, the fact that your child was put at risk. The other is criminal, the unauthorized removal of medical waste. Maine General Medical Center is taking this very seriously. What are our legal options? Margaret asked. The hospital has already begun a formal investigation, Attorney Cohen said. If there's evidence Helen deliberately removed medical waste, there could be criminal charges. As victims, you need to decide whether to press charges. Brian frowned. I don't want to put my mother in jail. I just want her to take responsibility. I understand, the attorney replied gently. Beyond legal action, think carefully about what you want to achieve. While they were talking, Brian's phone rang. Helen's name appeared on the screen. He hesitated, then answered. Brian, Helen said softly. Her voice was smaller than he'd ever heard it. I've called the whole family. Could you come over this evening? I want to explain. Brian looked at Margaret and Attorney Cohen. They both nodded slightly. All right, he said. We'll come at 5. That evening, Margaret and Brian arrived at Helen's house. Several cars were parked outside, signaling that the extended family had gathered. For safety, Noah had been left with Margaret's parents. Are you okay? Margaret asked, squeezing Brian's hand. Yes, he replied, his expression resolute. Let's face this together. In the living room, Brian's aunt and uncle, several cousins, and Helen's sister Martha were already seated. Helen and Diana stood off to the side, both looking tense. Thank you all for coming, Helen said weakly. I wanted to explain what I did. She began recounting the events of the previous day, but her version distorted the truth, framing it as a harmless prank that had been misunderstood. Wait, Margaret said, standing up. With the calm clarity of a nurse, she explained exactly what had happened, the nature of medical waste, the dangers it posed, and the potential effects on a baby. As she spoke, she pulled the hospital test results from her bag. This isn't just meanness, Margaret said firmly. It's misappropriation of medical waste, and Noah's life could have been at risk. The room fell silent. Helen's sister Martha was the first to speak. Helen, is this true? Helen didn't answer. She lowered her gaze to the floor. Diana stood up as if to protest, But Martha raised a hand, stopping her. "Helen, this isn't the first time you've done something like this," Martha said slowly. "Maybe it's time we told the family." The atmosphere in the room shifted. Brian looked at his aunt with confusion. "What do you mean?" Martha took a deep breath. "Helen has always had this pattern of behavior. Pranks on people she doesn't like. At first, they were harmless, but over time, they escalated." She began recounting incidents from the past, workplace conflicts, strange coincidences, and the real reasons behind Helen's troubled relationships. She spoke of the marriage that had quietly unraveled, of mounting problems at multiple workplaces, and of whispers among relatives that no one had ever dared to confront directly. "Your father left because of her behavior," Martha said to Brian. "No one wanted to address it head-on, and because of that, things only got worse." Brian collapsed into a chair, stunned. In his memory, his father had left because work was too demanding. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Brian asked, his voice trembling. "We thought we were protecting Helen," Martha said sadly. "But now I see that was a mistake." Helen broke down in tears. "I just wanted attention." Margaret addressed everyone in the room. "This isn't a personal conflict. As a healthcare professional, I had an obligation to report this. Maine General Medical Center has already begun an investigation." Helen looked up, fear filling her eyes. "Are you going to have me arrested?" "That isn't for us to decide," Margaret replied calmly. "But I'd like to propose a solution." She explained the conditions she and Brian had discussed. Helen would need to undergo professional counseling and commit seriously to treatment. Contact with Noah would be limited until clear progress was made. She would formally apologize to the medical center and cooperate fully with any legal proceedings. "I believe this is the best path forward," Margaret said. "The goal isn't punishment. It's to genuinely resolve the problem." Brian stood and faced his mother. "Mom, I've been turning a blind eye all these years. I didn't trust Margaret's intuition, and I'm sorry for that." He turned to Margaret briefly, then back to Helen. "But my son's safety comes first. Unless you get treatment and truly try to change, you won't see Noah. That's not negotiable." A long silence followed. Finally, Helen nodded. "I understand," she said in a small voice. Diana sat beside her mother, her expression softer than Margaret had ever seen it. "I was wrong too," Diana said quietly. "Margaret, I'm truly sorry." Later that night, driving home, Margaret and Brian sat in silence for a long time. "Thank you," Brian finally said. "You handled this professionally, and you gave my mother a chance to change. Families are complicated." Margaret smiled faintly, exhaustion etched into her face. "But we've taken the first step. The real challenge begins now." Forgiveness wasn't easy, but somewhere in their hearts, they believed that understanding and responsibility could open a path toward true healing. "Noah, look at Mama! Say cheese!" Margaret called, holding up her camera. Noah wore a blue and white hat as she snapped a photo. It was his second birthday, and the backyard was decorated with a small tent and colorful balloons. The spring air in Boston was mild, with flowers beginning to bloom. "The cake's ready," Brian said, stepping out of the kitchen carrying a cake shaped like a blue dinosaur. A genuine smile played on his face. The past year had been one of profound change for their family. A few months after the incident, Margaret and Brian had learned they were expecting their second child. Margaret's rounded belly now carried the family's hopes for new life. "The guests are here," Margaret said as the intercom buzzed. Margaret's parents arrived first. Behind them stood Helen, her expression tense. At her side was Caitlin, a social worker. "Hello, everyone," Margaret said calmly. Helen approached hesitantly, holding a small package. Over the past year, she had attended therapy twice a week, learning anger management and healthier ways to build relationships. Her contact with the family had been limited, and she was only allowed to see Noah under supervision. "Happy birthday, Noah," Helen said gently. Her voice no longer carried its old, domineering edge. "This is a present from Grandma." Brian accepted the package, carefully inspected it, then handed it to Noah. Inside was a handmade stuffed animal, a small bear made from soft cotton and clearly labeled safe materials. "You made this yourself?" Brian asked, surprised. "Yes," Helen replied shyly. "I learned in a craft class. This time it's truly handmade. I used only safe materials." Later, Diana arrived wearing a simple dress. The flashy makeup and sharp edges of her former self were gone. "Margaret," she said hesitantly, "let me know if there's anything I can help with." As the party continued, Margaret stood at the edge of the garden, quietly observing her family. Brian had grown into his role as a father, forming his own firm boundaries. Helen, though still imperfect, was slowly changing through counseling. Diana had begun separating emotionally from her mother and had moved into her own apartment. Lost in thought, Margaret turned and saw Brian beside her, smiling gently. "Just Mom is really trying," Brian said, watching Helen play with Noah under Caitlin's supervision. "It'll take time before I can fully trust her." "People can change," Margaret said softly, "but they have to choose it." Brian wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "If you hadn't stayed calm that day, we might not be here." Margaret smiled. "I didn't respond just as a nurse, but as a human being. A person's true value lies in the courage to admit mistakes and try to change." As dusk settled, the family gathered around the table to celebrate Noah's birthday. Healing broken relationships was a long journey, but this day marked a new beginning. Margaret placed a hand on her belly, feeling hope for the future. She knew that while families are never perfect, understanding and forgiveness can weave new bonds. The blanket remained locked away in the hospital's safety management department, but the changes it had set in motion had quietly woven new threads into their lives.